It was the summer before I started college, and I had just been to the pool with my girlfriend Vicki and was still laughing about something she said as I walked into our home. And I really wasn't prepared for the huge change in the emotional climate. Chaos reigned in our home that day. My dad was running through the house yelling that he was going to kill somebody and he was looking for a gun. My mother and my brother were trying their best to calm him down. My baby sister was crying and nobody seemed to notice, and I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know who Dad was talking about. I didn't know why he was angry. I just knew he was way out of control. I was trying to get some answers, but everybody was so upset that nobody could give me any. But I did see when my father ran back through the kitchen with a gun in hand and he peeled out of our quiet neighborhood at top speed. My 16-year-old brother, who was obviously an inexperienced driver, took off after him at the same speed Dad was going. And I was scared. I was scared for Dad, I was scared for whoever he was going after, but I was scared for my brother too, because not only was he inexperienced, but through blurry, tear-stained eyes, I wasn't sure how his vision was, and I knew he was upset. Well, it was time for me to go to work because Dad had just been drinking, is what set him off, and his drinking had taken away the college fund that had been set aside. I had to work to take care of school expenses, but I didn't want to go that night. I didn't want to leave my mother in the state that she was in, but she told me, she said, there's not a thing you can do and we need the money. So I got ready and went to the factory where I worked with motors, and I had the afternoon shift because I could make the most money, and that's what I was working towards. But I was upset too, and I was working with equipment that one needed to be clear-headed for safety issues there. All I could think of was my anger. In fact, I was so angry at my dad for what he was doing to our family that I was near the point of hate, and I had never felt that towards anybody. Well, I tried to pray, but I knew those prayers weren't getting anywhere. I mean, they weren't leaving the top of my head. And God reminded me that unconfessed sin separates us from God. But my question was, well, the sin was all on Dad's part. I couldn't confess that. Well, you know, God had a different view on that, because he reminded me, yes, your father has sinned, but you are not responsible for his sin. He is. You're responsible for your own. And mine at that moment was a feeling of hatred, of anger that was out of control, and it was a fear, it was a sin of unforgiveness. And so at that point, I broke down before the Lord and confessed my own sin and asked for forgiveness. 1 John 1:9 says that if we're faithful to confess our sins, he is faithful to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And I just felt, well, I can't even tell you what I felt. There was just an overpowering, overflowing within me that was relief. But God wasn't through, because he then told me I needed to apologize to my father. Well, I took a restroom break to go call home, hoping that he had made it back there safely. And I told him that I needed to talk with him, and it couldn't wait. So I asked him to come for my supper break and meet me there. Well, he did, and we met out in the car. And I confessed to my father what my feelings had been. And I apologized, and I asked for his forgiveness. My father hung his head in shame, and he said, "You don't owe me an apology." And I said, "Dad, I do. I've confessed my sin to the Lord, and he forgave me. But he told me I needed to ask for your forgiveness too." So I said, "I need to hear you say it. Do you forgive me?" And he said yes, and he hugged me and said he loved me. I didn't expect an apology from him. Dad had never made one of those. It wasn't in him. But the Lord had released me because I had done what He required of me. Well, clocked out about 11 o'clock, went home, was glad to see that there were 2 cars in the driveway and neither one seemed to have any problems. I went into a dark, quiet home. Everyone else was asleep, but I was too keyed up for that. I went into the living room and my Bible was on the coffee table and I just randomly flipped it open. And it was like a telescope was on one verse, and it was Matthew 17:20. It was that verse, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can tell that mountain to move, and it'll move. And I knew what my mountain was. My mountain was my father's drinking. Well, I felt like the Lord was just asking me, do you believe it? And I knew I couldn't be selective on the verses I believed and those I didn't. I had believed His word for my salvation, and I had to believe His word for my father's drinking. I fell flat on my face before the Lord in prayer and accepted His promise that that mountain could be moved. Well, after a time of prayer, I was washed out. I was able to go to bed and sleep in peace. But the next morning, I went to the breakfast table, and there was obviously not peace in the household. There was tense silence at the breakfast table. But I knew that things were going to be all right. Well, a couple of months later, I came home for my first visit from college, and I was talking with my mother, and I just asked her, I said, how have things been going? And she said, surprisingly well. I don't know what happened, but your father hasn't shown any signs of drinking since that incident before you left. And she said, maybe he was just scared sober. But within, there was a little smile, because I couldn't help but think, or maybe a mountain just moved a little. Maybe you have your own mountain to move. I know I learned several things from this experience. If we want to communicate with God, we've got to start with confession. And it's easy to judge others, but that's not our job, is it? Our job is to allow the Lord to show us our own sin and then to pray for others. I also learned that forgiveness is not always easy, but the Lord doesn't leave it to the one who has committed the bigger sin, because separation from God is sin, regardless of what it is. But sometimes it takes the more mature believer to take that first step and forgive. And forgiving is freeing to the one forgiving. And it softens the heart of the one who's forgiven. So what about you? Have you got a mountain that needs to be moved? Well, if so, I would encourage you to pray for that faith the size of a mustard seed. And then just wait, watch, see what God does.